Good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing. We wish to welcome you to the Silverlight Show. The silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in darkness. For those of you tuning in today, we welcome you in and salute your bravery. I was given, I guess you'd call it a prompt, from somebody very close to me who asked, why is there such hatred for the Jewish people and Israel in this world? And I wasn't really sure how to answer that question. I've given it about an hour's worth of thought. And I think I've come up with a way to do it. We're going to be doing historiography, history mixed with sociology. Because you can't really examine it in isolation. This is something that's gone on for a very long time and for very different reasons. So, without any further delay, let's begin. About 3,000 years ago, a couple kingdoms appear, pretty much out of nowhere. Northern Israel and Southern Israel. The tribes of Judah, Levi, and Benjamin in what's now called Judah, and Israel with the other 12 tribes. This is the point where I think we can really differentiate between the Bible and history. Because we do have relics going back to that very beginning, but we don't really have a confirmed archaeological study that truly details the exodus from Egypt. Now, it's not unusual for a people to take an exodus type scenario where you move from your area to a promised land. It repeats over and over. The Aztecs, no relation to the Israelites whatsoever. They have a very similar one about being brought to the land, the valley of, I'm not even going to try it. Basically Mexico City so they could set up their empire. And the Jews are no different than anybody else in using that narrative. That's not where we get to the difference. These are monotheistic people. Now, not long before this, we have Pharaoh Akhenaten, who tried his own monotheistic religion in Egypt. His problem was he was trying to be a revolutionary and have all the other gods neglected while Amun-Ra, his monotheistic god, being the god behind the sun, the one who grants us all of our sun and blessings, all that sort of stuff, he tried to do it within his lifetime. There's rumors that Tutankhamun was pressured into discontinuing this belief, and even that Akhenaten was basically Moses, picked up his family and everything and went somewhere else where he could practice the way he wanted. Again, this is prehistory as far as we're concerned. We have Akhenaten documented, we have his son Tutankhamun documented, but the whole out of Egypt escapade, we don't have very much solid evidence for that, which is strange because Egyptians love writing their history down, and they love it even more when they want to excise someone from history. Moving back to the actual people, again, having a one God policy is very strange to people in the ancient world, and it would be for quite some time. When we come in and you're used to, say your God is the God of the mountains, and that God commands so many sacrifices and stuff like that, but you also have his wife. who is the god. Females generally tend towards water, and therefore for her you must have these celebrations to ensure the fertility of the land. Then along come these Israelites, and maybe I should call them proto-Israelites, who are saying there's only one God. What do you mean? You need a God for, you know, the harvest. You need a God for wine to bless it to make it sanctuary. No, no, no. There's only one God that we need, and we can do everything from there. They sound like atheists, how we would consider them today. And that's why there's a lot of suspicion. Oh, they must be hiding a God somewhere. And of course, some people are going to follow multiple religions, just as they do today. Buddhism gets mixed in with Christianity so often in cults. I mean, they practically go hand in hand, even though they're completely different in mythology and in worship. But these Israelites supposedly launched wars against their relatives. The Philistines, no relation to the Palestinians. I'd like to keep that out of this except for one reference. The Hittites, completely different from the Hattis, who were an ancient empire in Turkey. Anatolia perhaps would be better to phrase it, the peninsula, whatever you want to call it. But these strangers are coming in, they are declaring wars, and trust me, wars were declared against the proto-Israelites as well. That's just the way some things are. Whether they were born in place, they unified late, whatever the case might be, that's simply the way things go. Wars are so common, it's unbelievable. A couple centuries go by, and Babylon knocks down the door. Babylon gets this brilliant idea. We're going to kick all the Jews out of Judea. Oh, by the way, at some point the 12 northern tribes go missing, or 10, I always forget how many go missing. But Babylon comes along and kicks them out. This is an interesting point in Jewish history. They're exiled into Babylon because, naturally, in a war, somebody went around and hunted down the educated people. I don't think it's rumored that the ancient proto-Israelites only used the oral tradition, but in Babylon was highly literate. And while they were outsiders in Babylon and treated as second-class citizens, they were given the chance to learn how to read and write, and people started writing down what they knew. Prophecies, a few books take place during the Exodus in Babylon. And eventually Persia kicks Babylon down, as they were prone to do. And one of the Persian emperors decides, hey, let's let the Jews go back to their homeland. Thus, the Jews come back and start rebuilding and build the second temple, parts of which are still standing to this day. By the way, the Dome of the Rock, which is supposedly the place of the ancient temple, look at it 360 degrees. It's very impressive from the front. Around back, not very impressive at all. Just a side note. As we pass these things, I'm going to make observations. So you have the Babylonians who literally conquered Israel, took its last king, and kept him as basically not a slave, but like a pet. And it mentions, and there he was fed all the days of his life, and that's the way that he was treated. The Persians, who are pretty much the big bullies on the block and always have been, reverse the idea that Babylon wanted to destroy Israel, and they restore the Judean Israelites. And they put Judah on the map again. Of course, as usual, empires change, things change, and I can't remember who comes and conquers Israel. they do the normal thing where they want to force the Israelites to worship multiple gods because, again, this idea of one God, oh, what does he look like? You can't understand. Well, what's his name? We can't tell you his name. It's literally ancient atheism. So this king, Antiochus, I remember his name, I don't remember where he was, he decided to start really putting the persecution into the Jews to get them to worship a god because it's hard to control people if you don't know what their values are, if you don't know who they worship. The Jewish people launched some guerrilla campaigns and over time eventually freed themselves from Antiochus. This then led to them rededicating the Second Temple and is the origin of the holiday of Hanukkah. Not too long later, another up-and-coming empire starts to knock at the door. Judah looks over the hills, and the might of Rome is standing against them. Yeah, we know how that one went. And Rome was going to hold them for about 300 years or more, and technically they didn't stop until much later in history. But let's just deal with the first couple hundred years. While they're under Roman rule, the Israelites do tend to revolt with regularity. They want their temple back, they want the money changers out of the temple, stuff like that. And here we're kind of getting into a fixed point in history where a lot of things start happening. One of the things that we see in Suetonius is that when Julius Caesar is assassinated, there's a delegation of Jewish people that come to pay their respects to Julius Caesar. There's two ways you can interpret this. Either Suetonius is saying, look how much his fame was that people from all over were coming, or you can interpret it as saying, Suetonius is saying, even our enemies are coming to mourn the loss of our great leader. It's really hard to tell, and I've got a copy of Suetonius right in front of me while I'm reading it. So you can see there's interaction between Jewish people and the highest people of power. Another pattern that will repeat itself. Time goes on. Augustus doesn't really seem to bother them much. I guess they weren't acting up very much. You really lose out on the history unless you realize this is a time of apocalyptic literature. People were writing all sorts of ideas about how God would punish everybody and enact his judgment, all those wonderful things. And among them were 12 people who either made up a character or all knew the same guy and were all literate and educated, and thus wrote another 40 or so books to add to the Bible that was already established in Babylon hundreds of years before. These guys are, of course, Christians, although they wouldn't have called themselves Christians. Jesus said to obey the law as it was written. His descendants didn't always agree on that. Enter Saul, or as you might know him, St. Paul. Saul was born Jewish, and he spent his life persecuting Christians. Now the Romans, this is madness. One atheist group persecuting another because they don't share their ideals. We don't understand this at all. But supposedly, on the way to Damascus, Saul is met by a vision where Jesus tells him, "Stop persecuting my people." Saul, who had a Roman name of Paul, which was quite common. The Jews have always been willing to adopt names in the regular vernacular. And Paul, as he is known now, goes on to write 14 of the books of the Bible, a pretty significant chunk. Paul just couldn't give up persecuting. I invite you to read his epistles and letters and stuff like that. They're all very accusatory. You're not doing this, you're not doing this. He fought with, I believe it was Simon. I could be wrong on this, because Simon was trying to instruct people in the the way Jewish people eat, the way that we structure our dinners, and the blessings we use. And Paul told him off, saying, "You're basically giving away that secret. That's not the way it should be. That you can't have Gentiles knowing Jewish secrets." And the funny part is, Paul was one of the most influential proselytizers of Christianity during the early period. Pretty much his whole life he's tramping back and forth and preaching his own interpretation of what Jesus said. The whole idea of what Jesus stood for was long gone before Paul or Saul came along and started persecuting everybody. The funny thing is, Simon and Paul were the ones who would wind up bringing Christianity to Rome. For not too long after this, Nero is deposed. We have the Year of the Four Emperors. The Jews revolt, and after a whole lot of weird stuff, oh gosh, I'm not even going to pretend I remember that emperor's name, but I know his children's names. But basically, they break into the temple. Somehow, magically, a fire starts. You're going to find this a lot with Roman conquests. Accidental fires happen lots. When Julius Caesar entered the Library of Alexandria, even though he knew how valuable it was, whoops, apparently the fire started there. Basically, if you ever come across ancient Romans and you have something valuable, don't let them have fire near it. That being said, as Jewish people don't proselytize, or they're not supposed to, whereas the Christian religion was founded on proselytization, they were a spreading force. Although mostly it was among the slaves in Rome. It was viewed as a slave religion, even though it did have people practicing it in higher places. It's one of the reasons why Nero was able to persecute the Christians, because the Jews were all either, well, they were all in Israel and traveling, not Israel, Judah, and traveling about to do their business, but the Christians were all over the place. So it was like almost like the Red Scare, where communists could be everywhere. Well, Christians could be everywhere. And if Nero thought the Christians were going to kill him and that's why they were going to persecute him, that'd be one of his lesser delusions. If you want, read about his relationship with his mother and get back to me. So like I said, that would be one of his lesser delusions, although one that probably cost a lot of people their lives. Now we have a split between Christianity and Judaism. The two start evolving apart. Judaism starts emphasizing law and adherence to it, whereas Christianity at this point was separating itself from that. Peter takes over the bishopry of Rome, which will eventually be known as the Pope. Now, the Pope is in a legal position. They're basically doing what all persecuted people have done, meeting in cellars and stuff like that. It takes about 300 years before Constantine comes along pulls together the Council of Nicaea and says, give us some rules on this darn religion so that everybody isn't following their own ways. His mother was supposedly a Christian, and Constantine may have been a Christian, he may not have been. This is all unknown. But at that point, the persecution is mostly over for the Christians. They're allowed to practice. A few emperors go insane and decide they're going to shut them down. Sadly, the lesson learned by the Christians during this persecution period was you're either on top or in control, or people are coming after you. And the churches are very strict on their rules precisely because of this. As Rome goes forward, it conquers more and more of the world. Actually, at this point, it's losing more and more of the world. But where it goes, it's leaving Christianized communities behind. It was, at some point, after Constantine, it was the state religion for most of the remainder of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire keeps going to the 1500s, but the Western one falls just before 600 AD. But its ideas are transferred to France, Francia, because the Romans never could make any real headway in Germany. But as these small despots and leaders and what would eventually become kings were evolving, they were willing to recognize the Jews as a separate people. This is where things get complicated. The Jews did not have to pay their local taxes. They were reserved for the king's protection, which meant they were reserved for the king's exploitation. So your neighbors are looking and seeing these people who supposedly are not being taxed, even though they're being taxed harder than most other people. There's also the idea that Jews should not be allowed to own property. This is a complicated one. But the land was supposed to be saved for the Christians and, the church-going people. Jews had to occupy other ways to make their money. Yes, we know about the banking. Believe me, the Jewish people had nothing on the Templars. We'll get to them in a little bit, though. Some of them had to become undertakers. Some of them had to become whatever it is they had to survive. Because one of the big things about Jewish culture is it encourages learning. It wants you to read books. It wants you to write. And since you weren't allowed to own property, you needed a job. Well, one of the best jobs you can get is being an accountant, being a lawyer, doing all that sort of things. And since you're not spending money on property upkeep, you can show off a little, get a little bling. You could have, gold, jewelry. You could deal in things. You just couldn't own property. Again, people are looking at this and saying, hey, he's a 800 AD version of Mr. T, and I have to work every day so I can have bread. See, there's this thing even to this day that if you're not working, like physically in a field digging or working on a construction site, you got a cushy job, you got it easy. Most of my listeners will understand life doesn't work like that. It's just as hard to collate flowcharts as it is to do an oil change. I picked an oil change on purpose because I can do one in about 15 minutes. And I'm self-taught. Well, I did have some help instructing me the first time, but yeah. Rotate tires will take me 5 minutes. I just put a door up. How much does that cost? Yeah, and I'm sitting here talking with a talk show. Not that I really consider this work. My books, yeah, that's a lot of work, but this, not so much. Anyway, It's a mentally grueling effort, and people don't understand mentally grueling is the same. So these people are jealously looking at, again, the 800 AD version of Mr. T, and they get jealous. And what do jealous people do? The same thing as everybody else, gossip, except they add things together and even make up some things. Oh, I heard he steals from little children. Oh, I heard this, that, the other thing. And eventually these rumors and gossip percolate. We get things like the blood libel. Supposedly, according to medieval Christians, the Jews would sacrifice a Christian child and use the blood to make their matzah. Matzah is flour, water, and virtually it's practically hardtack. There's no blood in the recipe whatsoever. But because of this Christian resentment that basically kept going from Roman resentment, from Persian resentment, from Babylonian resentment, all this keeps compounding because the Israelites will form a community. There's Jewish ghettos in many towns. Again, they're not allowed to own property, so the only place they can go is where the property is available. Because of that, they wind up shopping at different places. They invent their own languages, like Yiddish, which is part German, part Hebrew. And if you're Hasidic, you maintain a very traditional dress, which makes you absolutely stand out from the population. While they're busy having these boots with long toes that curl up and stuff like that, they're still in their hats and, well, you know the image I'm talking about. And this is the primary reason, is that separation has existed for so long, and it's encouraged people to make up stories about them. I live not far from Amish people. They're very isolationist, but at the same token, they're allowed to own property. They're actually very good at owning property. And they can open farmers markets and come and speak to the outside world, etc., etc., etc. Whereas with the Jewish people, there wasn't a lot of call for that. Yeah, the bankers probably had to deal with kings and noblemen and whoever else that wanted a loan. But other than that, nobody knew what was going on in the synagogues. Nobody knew what was happening. As a parallel, the Masons, nobody knows what's going on in their lodges for the most part, except for Masons themselves. And the Masons, while they keep secrets, I can assure you there's nothing in there that would bother you or scare you in any way if you knew the truth. But the secrecy is kind of what makes the order special, and it's the thing that makes people believe they're involved in so many crazy conspiracy theories. Same with the Jews. In the modern world, let's hop this up. We're going to skip the medieval times because, they get kicked out of some places, accepted in others, blah, blah, blah. In about 1910, you get the Protocols of the Elders of Zion published. And it was an attempt to convince the Tsar of Russia that there was a plot against him. Somebody was going to kill him. Now, originally, this is the Elders of Sion, S-I-O-N, which supposedly referred to a Russian secret society. Again, much like the Masons, you can find copy pastas of the Masons everywhere you look. And while Tsar Nicholas the second, I think, yes, the second, looked at this and said, "This is trash. Like, what kind of a forgery is this?" Tossed it out, but somebody got a hold of it and made little edits here and there, and it became the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, at that time, there was a movement called Zionism, which was to return the Jewish people to the Levant. So when this came out in its second edition, shall we call it, It made people freak out. It was a big deal for the time. Not too long afterwards, Henry Ford published The International Jew, which he was forced to apologize for, retract it, buy his copies up, etc. But why are these people so determined to expose Jewish people? Hmm. Again, lack of contact with them. I'm one of those people that bravely waded his way through Mein Kampf. Oh, what a horrible piece of trash. And one of the things that I've never forgotten it. Hitler was in a market somewhere and he saw a stranger that looked different from anybody else. And he says, "Is that a Jew?" And so he decides to ask the German version of the KKK what Jews are all about. This is his explanation about hating the Jews. Again, that's like me asking, is this a black person, and asking the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not going to get a reasonable perspective. Keep in mind Hitler's memoirs at that point, shall we call it, were heavily edited by Goebbels and his little inner circle. They all had things to add, things to subtract. They just wanted to tell their story because at that point they were in prison. They didn't have anything else to do. But if somebody can literally make up a story about seeing somebody different, and that's how they learned about Jewish people, it shows you how intolerant we are as a society. We know about the Holocaust, which we can attribute to Hitler, and he had a lot of accomplices, but at this point, any of them still alive, there's no point to punishing them. They would have been in their early 20s, and you kind of can't say no when an absolute dictator fascist tells you, this is your job, do it. There are brave examples of people who refuse, and unfortunately, torture is more effective than we think of it. That brave resistance doesn't exist like it does in the movies. Schindler's List, where somebody can quietly push things through, that happens. But people standing up for what's right, not so much. Then in 1949, maybe I should save this for a second part, but you know what, I'm here now. I'm made it through nearly 3,000 years of history. 1949, Israel is formed. Now, as soon as it's brought into existence, it's attacked from all sides. They make a stand, use World War II equipment and stuff like that, and they manage to take part of the land that was set aside from Palestine. Except there was a lot more land set aside for Palestine. Lebanon, Syria, all of them had agreed that they were going to give some of their lands to the Palestinians. Of course, they closed their border because of the war, but it's probably a little more sinister than they think. Free land that we get. To this day, the Palestinian refugees are still stuck. They're not allowed to immigrate to those countries, and they can't go back. They have no legal citizenship. These same nations that are keeping the refugees and not allowing them anywhere are happy to stand up at the United Nations and scream, look what they're doing to our Arab brothers. Well, look what you're doing to your Arab brothers. And this is a reality people don't like to hear about. This is why I'm trying to rush through the history of Israel, because there's a lot of it, but I could spend an hour on that. And recently, we know the whole Hamas-Israeli war. Now, there's a reason I single out Hamas. The West Bank Palestinians aren't doing too bad. They haven't encouraged terrorism, rocket shooting, killing Israelis in the streets. They took over farms, they started business, and Israel is helping them. Nobody talks about the West Bank people because they don't do anything. Hamas, about every 3 years, 2 to 3 years, starts bombing Israel. They send their leaders to foreign hotels where everything is taken care of by the local concierge, and I mean anything, while their people are just getting destroyed. And it's a sick cycle, and it needs to stop. But I knew that when this started. This happens every couple years, and it always surprises me. People forget Hamas always starts it. Hamas took over in 2000, said, okay, we've won the election. There's going to be no more elections. They get all the aid money. They don't give any to their people. They dig elaborate fortresses and send their leaders to different places so that nobody can get them. They don't help their people. And it's time to differentiate. We all want the Palestinians to succeed. There's no question. But Hamas needs to be rooted out. But they'll be happy if you don't mind, go and look up Palestinian Sesame Street on YouTube. Tell me what you watch. Are they teaching children to count? No. Are they teaching them Arabic? No. It's not very nice to see. So that's the story of the hatred through time. It's mostly being an isolated people with very different rules from what the mainstream is used to. And I don't think it's going to go away. Unless you could do like a denazification process, we're going to come back in another couple of years and we'll be talking about Hamas again. And I don't want that to happen. I want the people in Gaza's life to get better. They don't deserve what's happening, but their leaders do. And yeah, if you might recall, this started off with Hamas killing a few thousand Israelis. And they're lighting up the place with rockets every chance that they get. That's not how you negotiate a peace. And people can get into blind hatred for each other. If I could magically take the Israelis and send them to a beautiful planet and give Palestine all that leftover territory, I guarantee they'd either be invaded or there'd be a civil war in a short time, because the Middle East is not stable. The only thing that makes it stable at the present time is the Israeli state. And you know what? I don't know how long that's going to last, to be honest with you. But getting rid of Israel is not going to secure peace. And that's our biggest problem right now, is we need peace in that region. We need peace all over the world. Sorry, hippies and flower children and stuff. You need to come back and finish the job you started, because, hey, I'm no weak, lily-livered, coward. I am a veteran. I spilt my blood in the mud for this country and for freedom. Well, the freedom that we get. The freedom they allow us. But confronting hatred, especially irrational hatred, like stuff that's accumulated, stuff that's been told. I didn't even talk about the Khazars. Supposedly, the Jewish people that came out of Israel when Rome kicked them out, they stopped off in a kingdom of Khazaria. And supposedly the whole nation of Khazar converted over to Judaism. And then they came into Europe. This implies that the European Jews are not the same Jews that were the Judean state. There's only one problem. Again, zero history. There's evidence that the Jews went by that area. Some may have stopped. Some people might have converted. But it wasn't a whole nation. And the racists lean on this to try to say, these people have no claim in the Holy Land. It's the same as John Prester, who was a Christian king in the Far East who supposedly existed and even exchanged letters with a couple popes. You know what? He was false as well. But people will use information like this and make up their own ridiculous claims. And, well, to be honest, there hasn't been a new claim since the 1920s and 1930s. We know the people in the 20s and 30s were still segregating water taps because, ooh, that man's a different skin color than me. He can't use the same water as I use. We need to purge the prejudices of that period, and we have done a good job. But these racists, these people who want to continue these old myths, they're going to keep believing what they're going to keep believing. And while they have a right to believe what they want to believe, they are so ignorant that they don't realize they're basically echo chambering themselves. They won't listen to anything. They'll quote somebody with little, if any, authority, and they'll cling to that myth as hard as possible. Again, matzah. There's no evidence any blood has ever been used in any of it. Maybe somebody who is a mage or wizard or something like that did something crazy once or twice, but it's not a practice. And just like everybody else, some Jewish people are criminals, some Jewish people are saints. Most Jewish people fall somewhere in the middle. And that's what we need to realize, that everybody's the same there. I'm no saint. I ain't a criminal. So I'm somewhere in between, just like I believe most of the audience is. But with that, we're going to see if this video makes a difference, or if it gets me kicked off YouTube. So, with that, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Silverlight Show. I kept it under an hour. That's impressive. But then again, I skipped a whole lot. If you did, please like, share, because sharing is caring, and in this case, it might inform somebody. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Don't forget to click the bell icon down below, because that way you can be notified every single time there's a new episode, and we hope you have a fantastic day.